Okay, let's wait for one more minute and then we can go ahead. Okay, well, hi everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today at our third webinar at Testing Goy. My name is Lucia Rodriguez, and I have been a Testing Euro collaborator for 2 years. And for this first webinar series, we invited our keynote speakers from our past conference editions, and we are joined by Kevin Richardson today. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, how are you?
Good, and you?
Fine, thank you.
Okay, so just a few comments before we start. If you have any questions or comments about what Kevin will present, please go ahead and write them in the live comments panel that is located on the left side of your screen. We'll go through them at the end of Kevin's presentation. And of course, we will upload the webinar on our YouTube channel. So let's get started. We're very excited to have Kevin Richardson today as our special guest. We have the pleasure to have him at our third Testing Goy conference edition. So welcome, Kevin. It's a privilege to have you today. And thanks again for joining us. Let's just go ahead and start.
All right, it's my pleasure. It was 4 years ago that I spoke in Montevideo, and it seems like yesterday, so I'm happy to do it again. For those who weren't there or maybe don't know me, I am a user experience professional. I've been doing this work for 29 years now, and throughout my career, I have primarily focused on complex business and scientific applications, what we now tend to call enterprise UX. And I will get back to that, but I'd like to begin my talk by discussing a bunch of sharpened rocks. This is some of our earliest technology, and we improved on their design over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. And it took a long time because of social factors and population density, the slow development of the human brain, and importantly for us here today, the process by which they were designed. Early in our evolution, the decision to make a thing and the creation of that thing was done by the user of the thing. And this is really important because our ancestors were both designer, developer, and user. Their mental models of how things worked matched the reality of how things worked. And that meant that our earliest technology was very, very personal. And so over the course of these hundreds of thousands of years, people and their technology evolved pretty much together until well into the modern era. And then something completely different happened. I'd like to argue that that completely different something was the invention of the transistor in 1947. When it was invented at Bell Labs, a single transistor was large enough that it sat on a desktop. 7 years later, in 1954, transistors were small enough to allow for the creation of personal radios and radios in cars. 5 years after that, in 1959, transistors were small enough to fit 10 on a computer chip, and by just last year, 2019, Samsung announced their new terabyte chips that contain 2 trillion transistors. That's trillion with a T. From an evolutionary point of view, you just don't see that sort of advancement in a 70-year period. To put that into perspective, since that day in 1947, humans, you and I, have not evolved at all. But the complexity of our technology has evolved almost exponentially. Our technology is now so intricate, its ability to process information is so great that our own human perceptual and cognitive abilities, which we've honed over millions of years, pales in comparison. Once the evolution of technology and people diverged, our technology stopped being personal. And it's primarily because we no longer have an accurate understanding of how things work. We no longer have an accurate mental model that we can rely on. The problem is that the way stuff works is mysterious. It's hidden in the flow of electrons, and most importantly to us, and to me specifically, it's hidden behind the interface. And people like me, UX professionals, we are largely to blame for that. Traditionally, the goal of my profession has been to simplify interfaces, to hide complexity in order to make the technology easier to use. But doing that had the unintended consequence of making that same technology harder to understand. And that brings us to a philosophical question. Does it matter whether or not you understand how a thing works, as long as you can use it? And I argue that it absolutely does. Understanding how something works makes you better able to adapt to unexpected situations. It enables us to take advantage of our evolutionary strong points, like problem solving and troubleshooting, and it makes us more independent, more fully human. Instead, what we have are generations of people, young and old, who not only don't understand how or why things work the way they do, they don't expect to. And here's a slide that I reused from my presentation 4 years ago. This phrase, "I'm not good at computers," which I'm sure you've heard from family and friends, has become common and acceptable. As a UX professional, this is what keeps me up at night, because I know that I and the rest of my UX colleagues are to blame. As a profession, then, it is our responsibility to fix this. But first, some history. How did we get to this point? At the beginning of the technological age, organizations relied on training to get people to behave correctly. Training tries to bridge the gap between people and technology by forcing people to adapt to the needs of their technology. But training takes a lot of time, it's expensive, and it leads to only marginal improvement in performance. And that's not even saying anything about what it means to us as a culture to change as a result of our technology. As the shortcomings of training became apparent, people like me started to get asked to test actual software with actual people. This tended to decrease the need for training and improve usability because we were able to identify issues early on. But improving usability is a very low bar. It's like going into a restaurant and asking a waiter to serve you a meal that's edible, right? You shouldn't have to ask. From a focus solely on usability back in the 70s and 80s, UX has evolved to consider other areas like usefulness and more recently, desirability. What I'm suggesting is that it's time for user experience as a profession to evolve again, to add a new circle to that Venn diagram. We need to focus on making people successful when they use their technology. And that means we need to take an even broader view of our professional responsibilities and create designs that are not only usable and useful and desirable, but also understandable. It's time for us to move beyond simply helping people use their technology and start helping them understand it. And it doesn't matter whether it's a highly complex problem, like figuring out what this guy is doing for a living, or more well understood problems like purchasing the right pair of shoes online. Our job needs to be to figure out what people are trying to accomplish and supply them with the tools they need to be successful. Now, before I move on, I happen to be a big fan of Adidas, and that's why I used this screenshot here. And I don't know if anybody has any relationship to Adidas, works for Adidas, is the UX person at Adidas. But even large companies like Adidas could use some UX help, because that is a lot of filters just to buy a pair of sneakers. All right, I want to look at just two examples of what I mean when I talk about design for understanding. This person is monitoring the performance of a number of different systems that inserts commercials into TV shows. Because today there's no unified view of how the different systems interact with one another, it's almost impossible to know what happened if something goes wrong, because the users don't have an accurate mental model of how the systems behave relative to each other. My job was to figure out how to take those isolated pieces of data that, if they were combined, tell the operator what happened, and translate it into a coherent story that explains why it happened. And it's important to note that by presenting a sufficiently detailed story, we were able to also let the operator know what's likely to happen in the future, which changes their role substantially from one that's purely reactive to one that is now largely proactive and gives them more control over what happens. But enterprise systems don't often feel very personal. Their users don't seem like they have much in common with you and me. They're highly specialized, they're highly trained, they're doing highly complex tasks. So I wanted to look at a second example, a more personal example. These are my parents. They're actually pretty technical. They have iPhones, laptops, and iPad. And last Christmas, they were trying to buy this thing. In truth, I'm not entirely sure what it does, but they were trying to buy it online from a local craft store, and they had a gift certificate that they wanted to apply to the price. My mom added it to her cart, but she didn't notice the fine print link about coupons. It turns out that there are a lot of rules around what sort of coupons can be used online, and her gift certificate wasn't allowed. To make matters worse, the thing she was buying can't be purchased with a coupon at all. And to make matters even worse, if you try to use the gift certificate, the system doesn't let you know there's a problem. It looked to her like the gift certificate was accepted, but the displayed price didn't update. And that's when they called me in my car on the way home from work to ask if I could help, thinking that I was better at computers than they are. What they were really saying was that they hoped I had a better mental model of how e-commerce systems work. Well, just to tell you how the story ended, I was able to suggest that the order was displayed on a screen somewhere at this company, Joanne Fabric, and that it would be at least a couple of hours before someone pulled the item off a shelf and put it in a box, and that they had time to call customer service, which, after 45 minutes of waiting and back and forth, eventually resulted in the item with the gift certificate applied being shipped. So it all worked out well in the end. But there are a couple of key points at this section of my talk that I'd like you to remember. So based on everything that I've described so far, first off, consider that when we design things, whether it's an experience or a product or a piece of software, we are designing users' mental models. You and me and everyone else are hardwired to create mental models in order to explain how the world works. From what causes thunder to what causes pandemics, we are driven to try and explain why things happen. And when the cause isn't clear, we make stuff up, and we make decisions and take actions based on those made-up mental models. Only through user research, or design research as we're starting to call it now, can we understand what tasks users are trying to accomplish and why, how they expect to be able to accomplish them, and what aspects of the process need to be exposed in order to enable users to develop accurate mental models of how their systems work. Second, we need to do a better job of adapting technology to people. This might mean using design patterns that take advantage of what people do well from an evolutionary point of view. We are very good at recognizing information we've seen before. We are very good at applying what we know to new situations. We are very good at paying attention to one thing at a time. And conversely, we should be avoiding things or requiring users to do things that we know people are poor at. We are very bad at recalling prior information, which is why you always did better on multiple choice tests than on essay tests. We are also very bad at multitasking, regardless of what you may think about having the TV on and music and doing work on your laptop. What you're really doing there is not multitasking. You're paying attention to one thing at a time and moving that attention between items very quickly. Third, I want to talk a little bit about empathy. And here I may generate some angry comments. So I apologize in advance, because empathy is a popular subject among designers today. The notion is that in order to be a good designer, you need to be able to experience the world from the user's perspective. And that feels right, it feels true, but it's not. We are not the user, nor will we ever be the user. We are fundamentally different from them based on our experience and our education and the jobs that we do. That's the cardinal rule of UX. Empathy is subjective. It's not a repeatable, objective research methodology. If you accept the premise that empathy is required for good design, it means that you also accept that you'll be better at designing for some people than others based on your ability to empathize with them. Now consider the poor enterprise UX users, those highly trained experts doing highly complex tasks. People like heart surgeons and physicists and network engineers. They all use software applications today. How will you design for them if you can't empathize with them? And then, in case I haven't beaten that dead horse quite enough, we don't represent users. We are a research-based design profession. We discover user needs through the application of a variety of social science research methods. And it's not to say that I'm not pragmatic, right? I've been doing this long enough that I know if you're sitting in a meeting and the marketing person says, well, what should we do about adding feature X? And they turn to you because you're the UX person. It is the correct thing to do to provide your educated guess, ideally based on the research that you've previously done. But let's understand, even though I would do the exact same thing, what you tell them is still a guess. It may be an educated guess. It may be better than their guess by a lot, but it's still a guess. And if you rely on empathy alone as the basis for design decisions, what you are in effect saying is that you're designing for yourself. Ultimately, bridging the gap between people and their technology requires a systematic process of design that evolves our relationship with technology and makes us partners with it, rather than simply users of it. Early humans understood how and why the stone arrowhead worked. People today should be able to understand how their technology works. Our designs and my profession need to evolve to support that goal. I'm not saying this has to be done tomorrow, but there will be UX professionals doing this work long after I retire. And I would love it if one of them would find me someday, probably in some old age UX retirement home, and tell me that they fixed this. And if you don't have UX in your job title, you now know what needs to be done. Make sure they do it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. That was a really great presentation. Let me go through the live comments panels for question or comments. And just so you know, there's a delay of almost a minute between the time the questions reach YouTube and get to our streaming platform. So let's just take that into account.
Okay.
Just wait a couple minutes.
And if, all 7 people are now sitting in stunned silence, I'm okay with that too.
Thank you so much for your patience, Kevin.
Okay, I'm at home. COVID-19, there's nowhere else I can be.
Okay, we have a question from Mateo. He's asking how do you suggest to start a process for features implementation, for example?
Like an app feature. Oh, how to determine whether or not a new feature should be added to an application.
Yeah, like an application. That's
right. Ideally, based on the work that you've done in the past to understand what users are doing and why, you should have some knowledge about whether or not a feature would be useful, right? You should have gone out and seen that they do a particular set of tasks in order to accomplish some goal. Maybe some use an existing application, but it is incomplete, so they use features from other applications, even to the point where maybe, they've got stuff written on sticky notes and they've got manuals. But the purpose for adding a feature typically should come from one of 2 places. Either we know that users need such a thing because we see the absence of it in evidence of what they're doing now, or the other place they typically show up is somebody in marketing decides that, this would be a good idea, and it's a good idea because either I think somebody would use it or our competitors use it and we need to include it to reach parity with them. There are a host of business reasons that somebody might choose to incorporate something into an application. They are business reasons. What can you say? You could say, no, nobody needs this thing, but that hardly matters sometimes in the corporate world. But ideally, you should have some understanding of what's missing from a user's experience before you include something. And once you include that thing, what I want the takeaway to this to be is that you understand how it will affect the user's understanding of how the application works, right? If I take an action, do I have some sense, not maybe at the grisly code level detail, but do I have some sense of what the system is doing in the background in order to take my input and produce some output? See, the problem with not having somebody in front of me is I have no idea if that answered somebody's question well or not.
We have a second question from Jimena. She's asking about empathetic design, and she wants to know how you handle that, for example, for visually impaired people.
I think if we start by calling it design, right? And we do all design with a specific user community in mind, we can do the necessary research to understand what that user community is trying to accomplish, what their limitations are, both physical and technological, and we can design solutions to fit. Now, there are certainly an entire early history of user experience back when we were called human factors or usability experts that focused on creating libraries of knowledge that detailed how interaction needed to be structured in order to accommodate what people were naturally good and bad at. There are ISO standards for lots of these situations. And there are ISO standards for visually impaired populations as well. We could even take that to a bit more of a relatable group and say, how do I handle designing for people with different color deficiencies? Right? If I can't see well the difference between red and yellow or blue and green, red and green, blue and yellow, what should I do with my interface? And the standards that have been created tell you the answer to questions like that, right? You don't use color as the only way of providing information. You use color and shape, color and size, color and text. For visually impaired, it's hard to say a more exact example. I don't know. We could talk about experience design or design of the physical reality if you're designing a store in-store experience. But yeah, I'm going to stop there because at this point I'm going to start to guess because I don't have the research on visually impaired populations to be able to say exactly. I hope that helped you, man.
She said, thank you so much. You have a comment from Jimena also saying great presentation. Let's just wait a couple minutes to see if we get any other questions. If we don't, thank you so much, Kevin. It's been a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure. I'm sure people are trying to get to dinner.
Okay. So we reached the end of the webinar. If you have any other questions, Kevin shared his contact information in his PowerPoint, so please feel free to contact him. Thank you again, Kevin, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Sorry.
All right.
The next webinar will be next week on June 2nd, and we'll have Michael Bolton as a speaker, and we'll do an open session with him, so just bring your questions to Michael. Hope you can all join us. Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you everyone, and keep safe. Thank you so much.
Wow.
There is a last minute question.
Yes. There's a question from Mateo. Usually when we develop products, we think of MVP versions. Yeah. How should we translate the MVP into design?
That's an interesting question because it happens to me as well when I deal with product folks. There is an effort to force design into the development agile methodology. And I don't disagree that creating a minimal viable product is a valuable tool. What I disagree with is creating a minimal viable design without an understanding of what the eventual design will be. So the ideal situation, and one in which all designers should continually push, is to do what essentially amounts to an extended sprint zero, if you will, where the design of the entire application, or at least the majority of the application, is understood to some degree. I'm not saying every screen for the entire design has to be done up front, although the more the better, because then you can understand how that design deconstructs into a minimal viable product. And by creating it with that modularity in mind, you can use that to focus your sprint teams to specific pieces of functionality which feed specific new aspects of the design that you can incorporate later. So I think that's my answer. Don't be forced into a development methodology. That's the bottom line.
Kevin, you have a couple of thank yous from Andy, Martin, Mariana, and Joy for the presentation.
Oh. Well, I thank them for joining and tell them the check is in the mail.
Okay, will do.
Thank you very much. So let's see next week. Bye-bye.
Bye all.